Good morning, everyone. Thanks to, as you said, all of you that actually made it here. There was maybe some beer last night, right? I had a little myself, but I got to bed on time. So I'm very excited to be here. You may have noticed my lack of accent, if you don't know me. I'm not from around here. I'm not local. My French is terrible. I am from the United States. Hi, my name is Ryan. I'm on the Symphony core team, and I work at Symphony Casts. That's my main job, and I do lots of things with Symphony UX and also API platform. But probably the most important thing to know about me is that I have a really cool wife, and she's very mad with me for going to France without her. I mean, really, it's a problem. It's actually my first time in Europe without Liana. And we've been lucky to go lots of places. France is by far her favorite. It's the food. We did a cooking class once in Paris. It was amazing. So probably I'm going to be in trouble for a while once I get back from this. But she is at home, unfortunately. But she's watching my son. So I have a son. So that means I get to show you a photo of my son. I will only show you one photo. There it is. His name is Beckett. He's a cool guy. And maybe if some of you come to SymphonyCon, I think we're going to bring him to SymphonyCon, so he will get introduced to the community for the first time. Today's presentation is all about Webby. Webby is going to take us on a journey of the imagination. And in particular, we are in pursuit of a DTO system that we can love. And the first thing we're going to kind of talk about is providers and processors and what I call the central object during a request inside of API platform. So Webby has many hobbies, so he's decided that he needs to create an API for himself. So we have a class, Webby Hobby API, and we're going to put some properties in it, like whether it involves eating flies. And of course, notice this is important. This is just a class. This is not an entity, right? I've just created a class in my project. Cool. And then we're going to suddenly put the API resource attribute on top of it to expose this resource to our API. So the first thing is, what does that really give us? When I suddenly add this one line on this class, what happens? Well, probably the most important thing, kind of, is that we get a bunch of routes. So now I have routes for all of my different operations for this. And this is cool. None of these work. You get a 404 if you try the get. You can post, and it will give you a 201, but nothing happened. And the reason for that is because your API resource, this set of operations you're creating, it lives and dies by the provider and processor. Your provider and your processor are your API, really. They do all of the work. And we have none. And that's the key thing. When you just create a class and put the attribute above it, that is technically exposed to the API, but there's no provider to load the data. There's no processor to save the data. So you don't have an API yet. So let's walk through what happens when we make a GET request to the item endpoint. So first thing is the state provider, if we had one, so let's pretend we're going to write one, it's going to need to take the ID 5 and somehow load that data. And we don't care if it's the database or you're making some other API call. Somehow we get the data for that number 5 hobby, and we put it onto a Webby Hobby API object, and we return that. And the important thing that I want to focus on is that this becomes the central object during the request. Seems kind of obvious, right? Uh-oh. This is my fault. I'll take, it's coming back now. I'll take credit for having set up so early that my computer just went to sleep. Although, Apple, why is my computer going to sleep when I'm full screen on a presentation? That's a great question. So the central object here is the Webby Hobby API object. So if you've ever used the request attributes to get the data key out, this is what you're going to get. Of course, makes sense. And then the serializer is going to serialize this object into JSON. And in this case, there's no state processor. So it's a GET, so it's just the provider. So if we look at posting a new hobby, the serializer is going to deserialize directly into a new Webby Hobby API object. And that, once again, becomes our central object. So before it was the provider that was kind of loading it from somewhere, and that became the central object. This time it's the serializer that is creating it, but that still becomes the central object. And then the state processor is going to save that object, and then we're going to serialize that object to JSON. So in this case, no state provider. And then, of course, the most complex, I guess, would be patch or put, where you do have a state provider, because we need to load that number 5 hobby from wherever. Central object becomes the Webby Hobby API. We deserialize into that, we save it, and then we serialize that back to JSON. So the point is here that all of that was made possible by these state providers and state processors, loading the data, saving the data. Those are the missing pieces. And without them, we don't have an API. And with them, this is really the point, with them, we do have an API. Our API works. So those are the critical pieces that we actually need to put in when we're creating a custom resource. We have to build a provider, and we have to build a processor, and that's all we need to do. Okay, you need to add probably some validation rules and some security, but as far as getting your API to work, it's just the provider and the processor. So Webby is building this API. And now we realize we need a provider and processor. Great. But then while Webby is out camping before Webby starts the project, he starts to think, well, hold on a second, because I've been thinking about I need to build a custom provider and I need to build a custom processor. But with Doctrine, that stuff's automatic. I read on the documentation that I can put an API resource above an entity class, and then I don't have to do any of that. I don't have to write a provider. I don't have to write a processor. So if we look at a Webby Hobby entity and we put API resource above it, the question is, how is that different? We talked a moment ago about what happens when you put it above a class that is not an entity. Why is this different? Why can I put this above an entity and my API actually works immediately? And the thing that it gives you, you could probably guess from how much I'm talking about providers and processors, is as soon as you put it above an entity, you get free providers and free processors. So you get a item provider for your get one collection. You have a collection provider. Post, you get a persist processor. So basically, this is what you get out of the box as soon as you put it above an entity. In fact, if you added this configuration manually, you would just be kind of saying what the default already is. So then, while Webby's playing a live concert, kind of reflecting on these free state providers and free state processors, like this is a really good thing because not only do we not need to do that work, but the collection provider in particular is really important because that's what gives us the free pagination and also what powers the filter system. It's really nice to be able to put the API filter above and have the search filter built in and the range filter. That's all powered by the collection provider from Doctrine. So really, that's why it's so quick and fast to start with putting your API resource above your entity. But now Webby is thinking, but maybe instead of putting my API resource above an entity, even though it's so fast to get started, maybe I want to put it above a DTO instead. And by the way, we were talking before, DTO is a word that means many things. For me, it's a really short way to say a class that is not an entity. So I'm going to create a class that is not an entity, and I'm going to put API resource above that. So we're back to here. I'm just creating a class. I'm putting my API resource above it, and then putting whatever properties I want to have on it. So why might we choose a DTO instead of an entity? One of the biggest reasons is clean custom fields. So how many people have added weird custom fields to their entity resource in some way? Yeah, a good number of you. Yeah, it's like I have this field in my API, but it doesn't exist on my entity. So there are multiple solutions, and they're all weird, right? You're going to have to do something and then hope that someone who is reviewing your code doesn't notice what you're doing. Maybe you put a non-persisted property in your entity. Maybe you customize the normalizer and then deal with the fact that you don't have that field documented in your open API spec. Yeah, I'm seeing some nods. Yeah. So there's no great choice for custom fields. But if you have a DTO, you just create whatever properties you want on it. It models your API, right? So you just have whatever fields your API has. Avoiding serialization groups. Serialization groups are a tool that's often necessary when you have your entity as your API resource, because you are, of course, going to have fields in your entity that you don't want in your API. So you just have to kind of start to organize, this is a field for my entity, but not my API. And so serialization groups are something that we use to do that, but it complicates things. And of course, separation of concerns. And really, if you have a complex API on an entity, you end up having this giant class with entity rules on it and all these other rules for serialization and groups and custom fields, and they're all jammed into one class. But man, this is feeling so good to create this DTO. The freedom I have to have these custom fields. But now I need to implement the provider and the processors manually, because as soon as I put that API resource not above an entity, I don't get all of those Doctrine providers and processors anymore. I have to build them from scratch. And that means that the filtering system is gone. Now I'm creating custom filters. If I even want a simple search filter, that's a custom filter, because the search filter is from the Doctrine ORM. It's from Doctrine's collection provider. So Webby is thinking about this problem while playing video games. By the way, I think that might be Kevin Douglas, and that is Frank in PHP. Is trying to get it ready for production. Okay. And he says, wait a second. I saw this thing about state options on an obscure pull request by some core team member who might be in the 4th row who added this feature to API platform, but it's not documented yet. This is the answer here. So let's go back here, and now we're going to add this thing. Okay, so Antoine talked about this or showed this briefly in his presentation yesterday. So we're going to add state options, new options, entity class, Webby, hobby, : class. Okay, but okay, cool. What does that do? Well, I can tell you, remember, without that, none of my operations work yet, because I haven't built a provider or processor. So my Git endpoints are going to 404. As soon as I add that, it works. Okay, so how does it work? How and why, and what black magic is this? So when you add state options, 2 big things happen. One is that the core Doctrine providers and processors once again become the default. So it basically is like you have provider and processor keys that point to the Doctrine providers and processors. Okay, but we could have done that ourselves too, just a little bit of config. But if we had, for example, above our class set provider to Doctrine's collection provider, if we just did that, it wouldn't work, because the Doctrine collection provider would look at our class, see that it's not an entity, and then think, I don't know how to query from this. So the second thing that the state options does is that there's various places in the core of API platform, including the collection and item provider from Doctrine, that look for this. So you can open up the collection provider, and you'll see code in there that says, hey, is the state options entity class thing configured? If it is, I'll query from that entity. So this means that the collection provider actually works, because it's going to query from Webby Hobby, which means pagination works and filtering works. So let's look at what happens behind the scenes here. So the Doctrine item provider, in this case, is going to load the Webby Hobby entity object. Now, very important thing here, whatever your provider returns becomes the central object for the request. So just remember this fact. The central object is actually our entity object, not our API object, our DTO object. And then to go to JSON, and this is maybe a little inaccurate. Honestly, this part actually is so crazy, it confuses me. But your Webby Hobby entity object is actually serialized kind of into a Webby Hobby API, which is then kind of serialized into JSON. So there's a little bit of a serialization kind of magic that happens behind the scenes to make that happen. So is this the perfect solution then? I mean, I just added this one option, and I'm telling you that it works. Your endpoints work. There are a couple of problems. Don't worry, we're going to solve them. But it's not perfect yet. The first thing is it's actually not possible to have custom fields. That was the whole point of getting the class in the first place. And that's because of how it serializes the it kind of would see this field on our DTO and then go try to find it on our entity. Because remember, it kind of serializes the entity kind of into the DTO, and it's not there, and it panics, and you have a bad time. So you actually can't have custom fields, so that's a big problem. The state processors also don't work. They see that, like when you're saving, it sees that this is not an entity, and it doesn't do anything. It just skips. And these aren't bugs. This is just the system is kind of meant out of the box to do so much. But if we want to have it do everything, we need to do a little more work. And very importantly, the write operations have a different central object. So now we can see why I've been talking about this central object thing. So for example, let's look at what happens with a patch request when you're using this entity options thing. So the Doctrine state provider loads the entity object. Great. We've seen that. That becomes our central object. Now, the central object is important for many reasons, but one of them is the security. If you've ever used security and kind of used object in your security, maybe to pass to a custom voter, that central object is going to be what you use in your security expression. Maybe you have custom validators that are trying to get the object or some other custom code. So there's various places where you are very likely accessing that central object to do something. And remember, with the GET request, the entity was the central object. And so far, with the patch request, it's also the central object until the data is deserialized onto, the new data is deserialized. In that case, it actually deserializes kind of onto the entity, and then the entity becomes an API object. The point is, it changes. Early on in the request, the central object actually changes from the entity to the Webby Hobby API. So you now have a complex situation where certain operations are going to have the entity as the central object, and other operations, your write operations, are going to have your DTO as the central object. Good luck writing security rules that make any sense when you have these two different potential objects. And then your state processor tries to save that. It's left, what is this? This isn't an entity, and nothing happens. And then your Webby Hobby API actually becomes JSON. So now Webby's on vacation, thinking about this problem, wondering if this is not really a solution that's going to work. It seems so good, right? And then we have these major problems. And then after vacation, trying to work off the extra weight from the Mai Tais and the all-you-can-eat buffet, it occurs to Webby, we just need to make the DTO the central object in all cases, not this entity object that sometimes we need to make the DTO as the central object. So let's think about, on a high level, how we can do that. So let's go back to our patch request. This is kind of the goal here. So we are going to create a custom state provider. So we're going to write some code, and that's actually going to still call the Doctrine core provider. So we're still going to have the step one is still going to be that the Doctrine core provider does the query and returns the entity object. But then we're going to have our custom code change that, take that data from that entity, and actually create our DTO and put all the data onto it. And remember, whatever our provider returns becomes the central object. So suddenly the Webby Hobby API is going to be the central object instead of the entity, which was the central object before we added this. And then that JSON is going to be deserialized onto the Webby Hobby API object. Somebody's got to remind me to touch my computer every now and then. There we go. So that's nice. There's no weird like JSON being deserialized onto the entity onto the API object. We don't do that anymore. This is very simple. It's just the JSON is being deserialized onto our object like a very normal situation. So then we keep going. Just a reminder what our central object is. So then we're going to do the same thing on the processor. The processor is going to receive the central object, which is our DTO. We're going to write some code to change that to our entity object, kind of move the data back onto our entity object. And then we're going to call the core processor and pass it the entity object, and it's going to do the work of saving things. And then at the end, it's going to be our DTO object that is serialized to JSON normally. All right, so if that didn't make complete sense, that's OK, because I wanted to give you the big picture, and we're going to actually see how to do that. So first step is we're going to create a custom state provider. And the goal is actually to make this generic. My goal is to actually have a state provider that's going to work every time I want to do this DTO kind of tied to an entity situation. So here's my custom state provider. Let's pretend for a second that we're doing nothing complicated. We're just going to return some Webby Hobby API objects ourselves. So if we put the provider, if we set the provider to that, it'll work. We're not doing any queries yet, but that actually would work. But of course, we don't want to do the work, right? So then we're going to inject Doctrine's collection provider, because it takes care of all those queries for us. And then inside of our provider, the first thing we're going to do is not do the hard work. The first thing we're going to do is say, hey, collection provider, go do all the queries, do the pagination, apply the filters, do all that stuff, and give me the entities back that I should show on the page. And then we're going to take this very boring code, we're going to loop over them, and we're going to create new DTO objects with those and return those DTO objects. So this is very boring code here, but this works beautifully. This fixes that problem. That's all the code that we need to do that. And the result is it works. And we can add custom fields now. If we added a custom field, we would just populate it here. You have some weird custom field, just populate it here. You can use a service if you want to do some calculation. You just set it right here in your provider. So we have the clean custom fields. We avoid serialization groups, separations of concerns. And now we don't need to write the provider logic and processor logic. OK, we need a little bit, right, to do the transformation code. But we don't need to do all the querying and saving and all that kind of stuff manually. And we get the Doctrine filters and pagination. They're not gone. So like this actually works. It's kind of crazy, but I can go into my DTO object. I can use, that's the Doctrine search filter. And that's going to signal to the system that I want to allow them to search on the name field. And then we're going to do the reverse in the processor. So in the processor, we're going to receive the central object. So when we're saving, it's going to call process. That data is going to be our DTO object. And then we just need to go the other direction. We need to say, OK, let's take this and go back to our entity. So if our DTO has an ID, you can do this various different ways depending on how your API actually works. But the easiest way is if it has an ID, it must be like an edit operation. So let's query back for the entity object. Otherwise, let's create a new one. And then further down, I'm injecting the core processor, Doctrine processor, persist processor. Now we're just going to put the data from the DTO back onto our entity. And then we're going to call the core processor, and it's going to actually handle the saving. And then the last thing we need to remember to do is, if this is a new entity, then it just got an ID. So we put the ID onto the DTO. And then we return the DTO, because that's what's going to be serialized. So if you have any custom processing you need to do, hashing a user password, it just fits into this system really nicely, because you can put the code right here to do whatever processing you need to do. And that's it. It's those two things, and suddenly you do have this full control while not re-implementing any of that kind of crazy query logic stuff. There are a couple minor to-dos. They really are minor. I just wanted to mention them. We need to write a little code so that it works with the item provider and the remove processor. There's a couple lines of code to keep the pagination documentation, but minor stuff. This is small details, and we have a tutorial on this stuff anyways. So we have this working for one entity and one DTO, and we really like this, and we want to roll it out to our entire API so that we have DTOs everywhere. So okay, so we're thinking we need some sort of a reusable system. And Webby's thinking, when I look at that custom provider and custom processor that I just created, there's nothing specific about it. It really is generic, except for that mapping code. Taking the data from the DTO into the entity to DTO. Boy, that mapping between DTO and that's just such a classic problem. So if we could abstract that out, then we could just have a processor and a provider that you just put on top of every DTO you have. Add state options, add your provider and processor pointing at these core ones, and then it will just work. So this part, when I was making our tutorial about this is the part I struggled with. It's transferring data between two objects is such a common thing to do. And yet I had a hard time finding something that I really liked. You could technically do it with the Symfony serializer. You could kind of serialize one object into another one. There's something called Jane Automapper, which is really cool because it's you kind of give it two classes, and it kind of figures out what to do. Because most of the time, right, let's be honest, it's a name property here and a name property there. And so you don't need to be writing a lot of code between those. I struggled with that on some custom edge cases. I'm hoping that at some point someone will just tell me what I was doing wrong, but that is not the one that I ended up using. Or do you write something custom? Ultimately, transferring data is a boring task, but it's not a complex task, so you can always build something yourself. So much to my frustration, I built a very tiny, underwhelming library that I used in our tutorial called Micromapper, and I'll just show you how it works. Unlike Jane, you do everything manually. It's super boring, but it's really understandable. So if we're, every time you want to transfer from one object to another, like entity to DTO, you create a mapper class. You can see I have an attribute on top that says from Webby Hobby, so from the entity to the API. And then you have these two methods. In the first method, you're going from the entity to the Webby Hobby API. So you just kind of create the object. And then in the populate method, you populate the data on it. There's a technical reason why this is two methods and not one, but this is the least important part of the presentation. So I just wanted to show you how I solved this here. And then what this means, regardless of whether you use Micromapper or Jane Automapper or you write your own system, you have now a service layer that is able to convert between those two objects. So we can go back into our provider and our processor. I'll just show the provider, but we can go into our provider, and now we can use that. So in this case, we're looping over the entities, and we're just calling out to the Micromapper and saying map from this entity to operation arrow get class, which will be our Webby Hobby API class. And then we're going to get back those entity objects. So the Micromapper, again, this is kind of the least important part of the presentation, but it does work well. You get full control because you can really do anything you want. It's really easy to understand because there's no magic at all. And it's incredibly boring to use because you just write all the code by hand. So that can be a good thing or a bad thing. I think this is one of those spots where some people really hate writing mapping code, and so they want it to be done automatically. Other people want to feel like they have control. So anyways, so let's kind of review where we've been here, the view from space. So Webby's thinking, the great thing about DTOs are they are awesome for flexibility. I tend to be a very pragmatic or maybe lazy developer. So for me, I really want to put my API resource above my entity classes. And it doesn't matter how much Antoine and Kevin tell me not to, that the other things matter. It's just too much work for me. So I really want to be lazy and have the easy way out. But DTOs are awesome for flexibility. But they do require that custom state provider and processor, and we don't want to re-implement that. So this, I think, is a beautiful solution. You do have to do a little bit of work, but just the work that must be done by you, right? There's no framework or something that can convert between your entities and your DTOs perfectly every time. And what's nice about this is that's the only code you need to write. You just need to explain how I get from my entity class to my DTO and my DTO to my entity. So, and if you think about it from a high level, like what we're really doing is we're creating a custom resource, and we're making our we're making our DTO like the central object. That's really, as far as API platform is concerned, that's really the central object and the only object we're dealing with. It just happens to be that in our custom provider, secretly, instead of doing all the query logic manually, we're kind of like, hey, Doctrine collection provider, go do the work for me. And then we get it back, and before anybody notices, we change those back into our DTO objects. And then we return the DTO objects and say, see, API platform, DTO objects. There's no entities here. So it's all kind of hidden almost in an internal layer of us just leveraging these tools. But as far as API platform is concerned, it was pretty much all just DTOs the whole time, and there's nothing weird about our setup whatsoever. And then the last kind of step is if we have a mapping system, I don't care what you use, we can actually make this all reusable. And this is probably my current favorite thing inside of API platform. And thank you so much for listening to me and going on this journey with me. And thanks.